Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AMSA's webinar titled Unpacking LINC Placement, Delivery, and Assessment. My name is Julie Shipp, and I am AMSA's Settlement Language Coordinator, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. We would like to thank Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada for funding this event today. So, to engage you and find out more about you, we will host several polls throughout the webinar as well. So let's try poll number 1. We would like to know how you are viewing today's presentation. Are you watching alone or in a group? Please complete the poll on the platform. Okay, so we have 81% of people tuning in alone and 19% of people tuning in a group. Thank you for participating in the poll. So next, with me today at the helm during this webinar is Con Eraslan, our audiovisual coordinator. Thank you, Con, for your outstanding tech support. Calling in from Ottawa, we have Krista Walsh-Murray from the Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks. With us in the boardroom, we have Vaso Vallis, Executive Director at the Surrey Language Assessment and Referral Centre. Next, calling in from the Comox Valley, we have Marie Irving, LINC Coordinator and Instructor at the Immigrant Welcome Center. And also with us in the boardroom here at AMSA, we have Wes Schroeder, Owner and Manager of Western ESL Services. At the end of the webinar, as mentioned, we will have time for a Q&A. So let's get started with this webinar. I'd like to introduce Krista Walsh-Murray. She's been working as a project manager with the Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks since 2012. Primarily, she oversees the Centre's projects related to the development and implementation of CLB assessment tools and training. These include the CLB-PT, Canadian Language Benchmarks Placement Test, the CLB-PT Remote, Literacy Placement Test, and Milestones Test. As part of CCLB's collaboration with the Centre for Education and Training, also known as TSET, on the new CLBPA placement test, she is currently overseeing the reading and writing development. Krista holds a Master of Education, TESOL certification, and has over 10 years of experience in the fields of ESL, settlement, and employment services. To begin, Krista will provide a thorough overview of the Canadian language benchmarks, Niveau de compétence linguistique canadien, NCLC, in relation to language assessment. So, Krista, we'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Julie, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to be able to speak with you all today about the Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks and what the Centre does specifically in relation to its language assessment. So for the Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks, it is the Centre for expertise and support of the national standards in English and French for describing, measuring, and recognizing the second language proficiency of adult immigrants and prospective immigrants for living and working in Canada. It promotes their recognition and use as practical, fair, and reliable national standards for second language proficiency throughout Canada in educational, training, community, and workplace settings. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to stick to the English tools, the CLB. However, please note that we also have it available in French, which is known as the NCLC. You can go to the next slide. So what are the CLB? So the CLB are the Canadian Language Benchmarks. They're the national language standards for adult immigrants living and working in Canada. There are 12 at 3 stages of ability, which is known as the basic, intermediate, and advanced. Each stage of ability, they have the 4 skills for listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and they're used in community, study, and workplace-related settings. Next slide. So just to give you an overview, we have the CLB, again, the NCLC is the French, the standard, and different ways in which we can use these. So it can be in assessment, it can be in language training, teaching resources, citizenship, employment and essential skills. There's also benchmarking of occupations that the center does. But for the purposes of today's session, we are going to be focusing on assessment. And generally when we're talking about assessment, that's when someone wishes to learn English English or French once they come to Canada. They would go to an assessment center. They would receive what we call a placement result in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And then based on that placement, they would be able to select from a range of courses that are identified for them on assessment and program eligibility, which some of the people today that are here will speak to more later on in the presentation. And then language classes can include non-credit language training, bridge training, LINC, ELT, OSLT, I think EAL in terms of Vancouver. We are a national, or BC, we are a national organization, so depending on the province, the different terminology can exist. Okay, so we can go to the next slide.
All right, so poll number 2 is please rate your current knowledge level of CCLB's slate of assessment tools. Is your knowledge very high? Do you feel like you have medium knowledge? Or low, I could learn more about the variety of different tools. And these include the English and French versions of tests from the CLB-PT to the workplace language assessment to milestones. So please complete the poll. Okay, great. So we have some results here. So 12% of people said that their current knowledge of these tools is high. 56% of people said that their knowledge is at medium, and 33% said their knowledge was low. So Krista, I'll let you take it away with that information in mind.
Perfect, thank you. That's really interesting, 56% medium. Okay, so what we're gonna do, we'll just go to the next slide here. And this is looking at the different CLB assessment tools that are available, okay? So we have, oh, I think this might actually have a delay here. We have what we call the CLBPT, so that's the Canadian Language Benchmark Placement Test, which the majority of people are probably most familiar with. This is an English low stakes placement test. We also have the CLB-LPT, which is a literacy placement test. This is available across the country, although depending on the province, it may or may not be as widely used. We have the WLA, which is the workplace-focused assessment test. This is also not necessarily widely used across the country, but it is a placement test purpose. And then, of course, we have the French equivalent, the BTC, the BTR, and we have the BTC equivalent, which is the CLBPT equivalent in French, is the French placement test. And then we have our high stakes tests, which are milestones. That's in English. The BTR is the French equivalent. And then we have CLBAN, which is a high stakes nursing test. So depending on the type of a license an assessment center holds, they have rules and regulations around using the CLBPT assessment tool or any other tools that are available. So when we're talking about a test and what it means to be CLB aligned, the Canadian language benchmarks are a national standard used to describe the second language skills of adult immigrants. And so the competency and task-based and learner-centeredness of the tests are what is in play here. What we really want to focus on is the fact that the majority of the test takers that people would be using at any of these assessment centers are low stakes. It's only the milestones, the BTR and the CLBAN that are high stakes, and I'll get into that in a couple of slides. I do also want to highlight the portfolio-based language assessment, PBLA. That's the method of assessment that's used in LINC or ELA programs, any government-funded language training program. It's used once people are into a particular class, not prior to. So our licensed assessment sites, depending on the province, assessment centers and schools could be a separate site, meaning that you could have some people go to an assessment center and then they get referred to go into a particular language class, or it could be a situation where there could be one location where both assessment and placement and language classes happen in the one location. This decision is outside of CCLB. But the role of a licensed assessment site is to assess and recommend placements of learners into appropriate language classes. In order to become an assessment site, it needs to be approved, which means the Center for Canadian Language Benchmarks must receive a letter from a site's funder that provides support information for their approval, something within a contribution agreement that indicates that they have been designated an assessment site for a particular purpose. So in terms of the services, the sites can provide assessments in their various locations if they choose to, as long as the assessors are certified individuals. And we do have a list of approved CLBPT assessment sites, which can be found on our website. And when you get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, you'll be able to get a link to where you can find that. Okay. What I do want to highlight is that for placement purposes, the results of the CLBPT scores indicate the learner's general level of proficiency. So for example, if a learner has been assessed as a CLB2, that means they've achieved proficiency at CLB2, and they could be placed in a class that works towards a CLB3 outcome. And when I'm talking about a CLB2, I don't mean a CLB2 as in their whole level is a CLB2. They could get a CLB2 in listening, a CLB2 in speaking, a CLB3 maybe in reading, and a CLB3 in writing. So the benchmark is to each particular skill. And then one thing I do want to also note is that the CCLB, we do not train individuals on placement tests. We only provide training to approved assessor candidates for CLBPT licensed sites, because this is a placement tool used by licensed assessment providers for publicly funded organizations. So it's very often that the center will actually receive a request from an individual who's just looking to become an assessor, and unfortunately, that's not how this particular training works. They must actually be employed by an assessment center, and the assessment center has to make the recommendation to CCLB that they would like a particular individual trained before that training can take place. So in terms of accountability, when we're talking about CCLB, we're promoting the CLBs as practical, fair, and reliable national standards. It's the developer of the CLB-aligned assessments. It approves sites for license. It maintains the database of trained assessors and licensed sites, and it reinforces the appropriate use of the tools, and it does not support the use of the tools outside of the scope. While the CLBPT licensed sites are responsible for keeping track of all active assessors at their site, keeping all client assessment results safely secured, safeguarding all CLBPT materials, and administering CLBPT assessments within the scope of the tool. So when you're looking at eligibility to become a CLBPT licensed site, that site has to prove it has the ability to administer the test securely, it has the staff with qualifications to become CLBPT assessors, and it is a publicly funded language training program for newcomers or immigrants. We do, as I mentioned, require that a letter from someone from a government or a funding institution that wants this particular site to be trained, that they provide that letter and for what purpose. And only organizations that use the test for placement into EAL programs or bridging programs would qualify to become a CLBPT site. So now I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail about the CLB assessment tools. And I'm just going to note that I have included a number of different tools here that may or may not be familiar to you. So if there are any questions following the presentation, I can certainly provide you more information. Next slide. So the first one that I want to start with is the one that's most common to everybody, and that's called the Canadian Language Benchmarks Placement Test, or also the CLBPT. So the CLBPT is a low-stakes placement test. It's for the purpose to help place learners in language instruction programs appropriate for their level of competency in English. It was designed as an informal test for placement purposes. The interaction is friendly. It's very tailored to the individual. It's not validated for high stakes applications. So if you're thinking of something like the IELTS or the TOEFL or the CLPIP, the Canadian Language Benchmark Placement Test is not at that level of testing. Okay. I will say the test has been in operation for 17 years or so. And of course, that means over time, the content has been continuously exposed to clients. We do think that it is possible clients can do better on a CLBPT over a high stakes test because it's more informal or because they might be more familiar with the test. And because it's less formal and it's administered one-on-one with an individual assessor, their goal is to diagnose the needs and refer the clients to programs and place them in specific classrooms. So this interaction can be friendly, which is also tailored to the individual. It does assess the 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and a client would get a separate benchmark for each skill. And what I really want to highlight is that there's a margin of error of plus or minus 1 benchmark with this test, which is also why we don't classify it into the high stakes range, because although on a given day someone could get assessed at a 2 or a 3, a 2 in speaking, they could be anywhere between a 1 and a 3. So again, the IELTS, the CLPIP, the TOEFL, these tests are much more rigorous formal assessments, okay? They're a lot longer. This particular test takes about 1.5 hours, roughly, to administer. And it can be offered face-to-face. It can be offered itinerantly, which would involve an assessor going to a particular location where there's a client to do the assessment face-to-face. And it's also offered remotely, which is through the computer. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Next slide. Okay, so for remote, when we're talking about remote, that refers to offering the CLBPT via a computer. This means that an identified licensed CLBPT assessment site can set up proctor sites and proctors in communities that don't have an assessment site and offer the assessment. Okay, so this does differ from that itinerant assessment, which involves a licensed CLBPT assessment site sending a certified assessor to a particular location to administer that assessment face-to-face. So in terms of CLBPT, there are currently 27 licensed assessment sites in BC. And of those 27, 3 of them are designated remote. They provide a remote assessment option if it's needed, and I've listed them there, okay? Notice that for ISS of BC, that's specific to their workplace training right now. And then in Vancouver, we have Western ESL Services, and in Victoria, we have the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. Okay, across the country, there are currently 12 sites that offer CLBPT remote, and 4 actually offer the BTC, which is the French version of remote assessment. And only the sites that have been identified by IRCC are able to deliver remote assessment at this time. Okay, so in terms of setting up for a remote assessment, CCLB is responsible for the initial training of the CLBPT remote assessors. It's basically someone who's already trained as a CLBPT assessor, but for them to understand how to administer the test on a remote platform. And then once those assessors are trained, they're able to go and train their own colleagues, and they are also responsible for identifying and training identifying proctor sites and training proctors in areas if the request is there. So when I talk about the CLBPT, one thing that I keep saying is that it's a low stakes assessment. And this is really important. It's an appropriate use. The Canadian Language Benchmarks Placement Test has been developed for placement into federally or provincially funded LINC, EAL, or a training program that has a language component, okay? As I said, with the margin of error at plus or minus 1 benchmark, any assessment that is outside the scope of the tool and the license is not endorsed by the Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks. And so CCLB, any of its licensed assessment centers or certified CLBPT language assessors are not liable when results are used for purposes outside of the scope of the tool. As I said earlier, if someone is assessed at a benchmark 3 in a particular skill, this means they could be anywhere between a benchmark 2 and a benchmark 4. So the rigor and reliability of this test is not the same level as high stakes tests such as IELTS, TOEFL, CLPIP, or any of those. And next slide. We had some issues, or we have heard, that there are sites that do offer and advertise preparation courses and training by the private sector, and we have raised the issues of these private community colleges offering the test and prep with our funder. We've actually even spoken to people with the government of BC regarding regarding issues with the incorrect use of the test. And so what we've done at this point, we added a disclaimer a couple of years ago about the appropriate use to the form. And it's just at the bottom here, everything that I just said in the slide highlighted in red, that if a particular individual goes to an assessment site or goes to a location and say, hey, I have this CLBPT test and I want to get into, I don't know, a particular academic program and this is my benchmark, well, the idea here is that we're not supporting that. So if the college or the university takes that test, that's not something that we will endorse. So all we can do at this point is to continue to message about the appropriate uses of the test.
Okay, so now we're going into our poll number 3. Please rate your ability to explain CCLB's high stakes versus low stakes tests. Krista already mentioned a little bit about that, but what's to come is a little bit more information. Are you confident, sufficient, or do you need improvement in explaining these differences? Okay, so we have some results here. So in rating your ability to explain high stakes versus low stakes types of tests, 45% of you feel confident. 34% of you feel you have sufficient knowledge, and 20% of you feel you need a bit of improvement on that. So Krista, I'll let you take it away with that knowledge in mind.
Perfect, that's great. Yeah, it's definitely something that when you're not using it all the time, that it can definitely be confusing because you think a test is a test is a test, but there's also a lot more development and rigor and validity that goes into more of those higher stake tests, and in terms of just the way it's administered and the security is around that is very different from our placement test. And our placement test hasn't been validated for use for high stakes purposes. So if somebody were to accept a particular placement test into something that would be considered a high stakes nature citizenship, it could be for academic programming. That's not a language component, but something maybe they want to go in, become an engineer into an engineering program, or maybe they would get denied a job because they didn't have a particular level on the placement test. That's all high stakes purposes, and that's not where the CLBPT can be used. That's where you have to have those higher stakes tests, such as the IELTS or the TOEFL. Okay. So one thing that I want to talk about is future direction. So as I said, the CLBPT has been around for about 17 years or so now. And so we have actually started a collaboration with the Center for Education and Training. They're known as TCET, where we're developing a new placement test. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with TCET, they are in Toronto. They also offer a number of different CLB referenced assessments. They have the CLB-A, which is a placement test similar to the CLBPT, although it takes longer to administer that particular test. They also offer a literacy test. They offer an online self-assessment. So they have a number of different CLB-based tests as well. Within Ontario, there's actually a mandate that's assessment centers have to use each test 50% of the time, and how they do that is up to the discretion of the particular site, meaning that some sites decide, okay, well, I'm going to offer CLBPT testing on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I'm going to do CLB-A testing on Tuesday, Thursday, or they might do AM for CLB-A or PM for CLBPT, whatever that is. I think Ontario is a bit of a unique situation. As we get outside of Ontario, the CLBPT tends to be more widely used. But at the core, they are both placement tests that are CLB referenced. And the CLB-A actually has been around just as long, if not longer, than the CLB-PT. And so there has been some discussions with funders in terms of, the number of forms and if there's a way that we can update these particular tools. And so IRCC actually did fund the development of a new placement assessment. And again, the idea is that it's still to assess those individuals that are wishing to enter. I have federally funded language training programs right here on the slide because right now it is a federally funded initiative. However, it could potentially be for any funded training program. Okay, and so the idea is that because those current versions are dated, and they're also aligned in what we would call previous versions of the Canadian language benchmarks. So right now, the current version of the Canadian language benchmarks was revised in 2012. And that is the standard that we are actually developing, the CLB-PA2. The CLB-PT was aligned to the 2000 version of the Canadian language benchmarks, and the CLB-A was aligned to the 1996 version. So you can see that there are a little bit of datedness there, which is why we are coming out, or we are developing now, a new placement assessment. And so with this, we will have 2 test forms for the speaking and writing, which will have different content and themes. We'll have one for listening and reading, and it's going to be more of a semi-adaptive test. Again, low stakes, so it will not be at the caliber of an IELTS or a TOEFL. So just changing gears here for a second, I am going to reference that there is also the Canadian Language Benchmark online self-assessment, and anybody who would like to go to this, they can. The link is there. These assessments measure only receptive skills, so they're reading and listening, and basically registered users receive a benchmark range instead of a specific score. So for example, a user who would go on and do this could receive a benchmark range of 5 to 6, for example, in reading or listening. So it is a free online assessment. It's available to anyone who has access to internet. Again, it provides very general CLB levels in reading and listening, and it goes from a scale of 1 to 8. Okay. So the idea of this is that they're intended to give users a general indication of language proficiency, if they're planning or making decisions about further language training. But the results for this are not official, and they're not intended for academic, immigration, or citizenship purposes. And they are not used at language assessment centers. So the online assessment, and I should say it is also available in French, it does not help speed up any process once clients arrive in Canada to get into a particular language class. If they do want to go that route, they still have to do the official assessment, which is the CLBA or CLBPT, in order to take these language classes. But I still wanted to bring it up in case people might be aware that this is another tool that the center has made available. So we also have a literacy placement tool. We've had literacy placement tools available for quite some time, and the way the literacy placement tool, it can be used by instructors within the classroom, or in some provinces, assessment centers use it as well. Last year, we were funded by IRCC to do a revision to the literacy placement tool that is available to current instructors and assessors, and we've now actually made a division in the sense that we have developed a tool that's specifically for assessment centers and a tool that's specifically for instructors. We're still waiting for IRCC in our communication with them as to when everything will be rolling out, but it is based on our revised 2014 ESL for literacy learners document. It's also low stakes, and it has a jump off point for the PT. So if people were using the PT or the A or even the new CLBPA, and I'm sorry for all these acronyms because it gets confusing, but there is an ability and a place where people or where assessment centers, if they're going that route and they use this new tool, that they could incorporate the literacy placement test if they wish to do. This new test, it will include a first language screener task in 35 languages. Our current literacy placement test or tool does not do that. And as I said, we are in the process of working with IRCC in terms of how we are going to implement that in assessment centers. And again, because we are a national organization, depending on the province, the use of the tool and the way in which it is used does vary, depending on the need. So the other assessment that I do want to just highlight, because it is one of the assessment tools that the center has developed, is the WLA and, well, the ELTPA, its placement, again, low stakes. WLA stands for the Workplace Language Assessment. ELTPA stands for Enhanced Language Training Placement Assessment. That's TSET's version of the test. Basically, what these are doing is they're relating to work or work readiness settings. So with both of these tests, they are assessing at the higher benchmark range. So the WLA is benchmark 7 to 10. The ELTPA is 6 to 9. In order to offer, people have to go through the CLBPT or the CLBA first, which also can be quite time consuming for assessment centers if they're looking at going into this direction. I don't believe that it is widely used, but it is available to assessment centers if they wish to use it. But again, when we're talking about placement, and it is placement, it's low stakes, it's primarily the CLBPT that would be used across the board. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to move, back one. I'm going to move into the high stakes test. So CCLB has developed a high stakes assessment. It's called Milestones. In French, it's referred to as the BTR. And with this particular test, it covers benchmark 3 to 9+. So with our placement test, we're looking at benchmarks 1 to 8. So this one does have more of a range there. It is a more rigorous, standardized, formal 4-hour administration. So as I said before, the purpose of the placement test is, it's more informal. You're trying to work with the individual to find out what it is that they need. This particular test has a lot more security around it. It's a lot more, it's longer, it's more formal, and it is designed and validated for high stakes contexts. So in 2015 to 2016, it was actually used as part of the language portion of the settlement program evaluation component for LINC through IRCC. And it is now actually being used as part of IRCC's 2018-2019 LINC program evaluation. So this is a particular test that assessment centers currently do not have licenses for. The reason they do not have licenses for is because of the nature in which it is being used, and because IRCC does own the test at this particular time, their decision is to use it as part of the settlement program evaluation. And so the way in which that test is administered is much different from the CLBPT placement test. We actually hire individuals in different provinces to be part of administering different skills. We could have speaking assessors that are hired just to do speaking assessments. We could have writing scorers, writing invigilators hired just to do the writing component. And then we have invigilators hired to be able to administer the reading and the listening or the writing components. So there are different roles to this particular test and a different way in which it is currently administered at this time. So because a site has a CLBPT license, it does not mean that they will have a milestones license. And if it does get to that point that assessment centers would be able to apply for or would be able to administer this particular test, it would still be that same process where they would have to go and they would actually have to get the license in order to be able to do so. And the other thing that I just wanted to bring up, and I'm going to bring up this this briefly because I believe my time is almost up here, but the portfolio-based language assessment, or PBLA. So I'm not sure how many people here might be familiar with PBLA. It is, again, a different tool. It's once people are in to their language training program. So everything that I've talked about today in terms of the CLBPT, the online self-assessment, the WLA, the literacy placement test. Those are all assessments that are prior to people going into the language training programs. For PBLA, this is a teaching and assessment model that's designed to enhance nationwide consistency and standards of quality in English as an additional language training for adult newcomers to Canada. And CCLB's role in this is supporting IRCC in its implementation of PBLA in LINC or ELA programs. And so what we do have, we have a lot of information in terms of the PBLA practice guidelines, and there's a link there as to where you can go if you want to have some more information about this particular assessment. I will say that this can kind of go into a whole other level of discussion, so I'm going to leave it here for that. But any questions that you might have for PBLA, you're always welcome to contact me following the session. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so the tools and resources around CLB or NCLC for French and assessment can be found on our website, language.ca. You can also contact us if you have any further questions. And I thank you all for your time. And I will hand it on.
Great, thank you so much, Krista, for your presentation. That was fantastic. I learned a lot myself about some of the questions I had or places where I got confused with different tests. So thank you. I'd like to ask everyone to please submit your questions for Krista using the GoToWebinar question box. Tweet using the hashtag AMSA events, or email your questions to sdimitra@amsa.org. And we will collect those for the question and answer period after all of our presenters. So next, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Vaso Valles. She has been operating the Surrey Language Assessment Centre since 2005. She was the LINC assessor for Northern BC from 1993 until her relocation to the Lower Mainland in 2000. As a partner in Anne Jeffrey and Associates in Prince George, Vaso worked on Canadian Job Strategies projects targeting immigrant and mainstream displaced workers and developed the curriculum for employment search programs. She also took part in the production of detailed training design for underemployed immigrants in Northern BC, including the designing and development of the Career Exploration Centre. She is currently serving on the Settlement Language Working Group and the City of Surrey's Immigrant and Refugee Advisory Committees. Vaso will expand on the concept of accountability that Krista introduced to us, and she will explain the best practices of assessment centers. So take it away, Vaso.
Thank you, Julie. An issue we need to address is ensuring the validity of results obtained from the use of the CCLBT. This includes ensuring that the tools are used within the scope of the tools themselves and within the scope of the license granted by CCLB. The CCLBPT is a valuable tool because the results are used to assess for access to a language and occupational training. This value means that we need to ensure the validity of results and maintain the integrity of the tool, and we need also to ensure that clients are obtaining legitimate placement results. A related example came up recently with respect to the IELTS test. Niagara College recently required over 400 applicants to retake the IELTS test after concerns were raised about the validity of previously obtained test results. Obviously, we would like to ensure that something similar doesn't occur with CLBPT or other CCLB tools. The focus of the assessment center is in determining as accurately as possible the level of placement and referring the client to appropriate language training facilities based on the required training level, instruction times, location, childcare availability, and wait times. Keeping track of assessments placement at assessment center allows us also to measure the need for classroom spaces in geographical areas. Clients should be visiting assessment centers regardless of space availability in classrooms. Separating the assessment and placement functions from the language training and assessment or learning functions can prevent conflict of interest. Separation also makes the system more efficient as clients, once they're given a CLBPT, have access to any language training facility in the region based on their assessed level and their needs and preferences. This mechanism fosters collaboration among SPOs and support integration for clients. Next slide. License versus certification, a big issue for us. There's a significant difference between being a certified assessor and being licensed, having a license. Usually language training organizations, LTOs, are licensed to administer the CLBPT through the assessors they employ. In this instance, the LTO is the licensee and the assessor is not licensed. When the CLBPT assessor ceases to be employed by the licensed organization, the assessor is not licensed by CCLB to conduct assessments. They must be employed by another licensee, or if the situation warrants, they should apply for license. Assessment materials and kit belong to the licensee, not the assessor. Protocols should be developed regarding the safekeeping of CLBPT materials to prevent unauthorized use or copying. Protocols should also be developed regarding the return and safekeeping of CLBPT materials, including the CLBPT kits used by assessors when assessors stop working for a licensee. Non-active assessors should be notified as soon as they stop working for an assessment center that they're not licensed and they should not be working independently. That's all I had to say on that subject. Thank you, Julie.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your presentation, Vaso. Please send us your questions for Vaso using the GoToWebinar question box, Twitter, or email your questions to sdemitra@amsa.org. We will now launch poll number 4 to get to know your knowledge of smaller center assessment practices. Please rate your awareness of the realities and best practices being used in placement, delivery, and assessment in smaller language training centers as high, medium, or low. And we have some results for you. So 17% of you rate your awareness of placement and assessment in smaller centers as high. 47% of you rate your knowledge and awareness at medium, and 36% of you rate it at low. So, Marie, you can use that knowledge. Most people are at the medium awareness. So, I will now introduce Marie Irving. Our next speaker, Marie Irving, has close to 2 decades of teaching experience. Before moving to Vancouver Island, Marie worked at Langara College in Vancouver as an instructor in an academic English language program. After moving to the Comox Valley, she was employed as a LINC instructor at North Island College, and then hired in 2017 by the Immigrant Welcome Center in North Vancouver Island to assist in creating their first ever newly funded LINC offering. Marie is the LINC coordinator and instructor for the Comox Valley branch, lead teacher for the organization, a certified CLBPT assessor, team manager, and community liaison for the Comox Valley branch. Wearing many hats, Marie assesses approximately 30 newcomers per year. So let's pass it over to Marie Irving.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everyone. Yeah, that's a lot of roles that I have here. But as Julie mentioned, I'm going to talk about what assessment center, or what assessment and placement looks like in a smaller organization. I work at the Multicultural Immigrant Services Association of North Vancouver Island, also known as the Immigrant Welcome Center. And if you look on the map there, we basically cover the pink and blue areas of Vancouver Island. Also, as Julie mentioned, I have, and I think this is typical in smaller organizations where one person has a variety of roles, and my roles are coordinator and instructor. I'm the assessor, I'm the lead teacher. I coordinate volunteers, and the LINC team manager. Next slide. I wanted to share a little bit about our organization's background. So if you look on the map, we have 2 locations. One's in the Comox Valley, that's where I work, and the other one is in Campbell River. I have a colleague named Chris Gunn who has the same position as I have, but he works in Campbell River. We serve an area, a huge area, which has its challenges. We have clients from over 100 different countries, and I think most significantly is we are a newly funded LINC provider. We became funded in 2017, so it's involved a lot of learning, and we've had a lot of growth too since we started doing the LINC program here. We are a licensed assessment site, as I mentioned. We have 2 certified assessors. Together, we do approximately 70 assessments per year. And we do assessments primarily for LINC placement into our own program. We also do assessments for LINC home study referrals. We do a fair number of those because we don't have intermediate or advanced level LINC classes. And we also may do assessments for other organizations. We've had, for example, one private college that did want a student to get an assessment. And we may also do an assessment so that we can put a student or put a client on our wait list. To do the CLB-PT administration, we usually do those face-to-face, either in Comox Valley or Campbell River. We can do itinerant assessments in other locations, such as Port Hardy. We rarely do those, though, mostly because of time. They would have to be done on the weekends because we work 5 days a week. So we'd have to go travel somewhere on a Saturday or a Sunday, and then there'd be a lot of cost associated with that. So there's travel cost, extra wages, renting a space to do the assessment. So we have done it, but it's rare. And clients do miss out because we're not able to get to them. So in my role as assessor, the client always goes to settlement first, and settlement determines their needs, and then they decide if they should be referred to me. Once I receive the client's information, I have to determine the level of priority. So we only do about 3 to 4 assessments a month because they take time. We're incredibly busy. We try to do them on one day of the month. And if we have more than one, or if we have lots of clients who need to be assessed, we have to sort of decide who needs to be assessed this month and who can wait for another 2 to 3 months. And to think about when I think about those priorities, I think about who's the funder, first of all, because in our classes, we take IRCC funded students and provincially funded students, but we have a certain target number that we try to meet. So the funder is important. We also think about the LINC level. If we give priority to the lower level students, again, my class is one integrated multi-level class, CLB 1 to 3. So we tend to give priority to the students who are at the lower level. We look at class availability. We only have one class. It's happens in the morning. If the client can't make it, then there are very few options for them. And we also consider the needs of the client. So we will sometimes, if we think about the student's work schedule, for example. Then once we've decided that this is somebody that we should get in right away or somebody that can wait longer, we book an assessment time, and then I would assess and refer the client as necessary. Next slide. There are a lot of challenges. One of them, as I mentioned, is determining priorities. So of course, the students have different priorities. Our funders have different priorities as well. And we also look at, think about how vulnerable is that client. There are the time constraints that we always have to sort of prioritize what we're spending time on. There are funding challenges. As I mentioned before, we're only able to provide one class that is integrated and multi-level, which isn't ideal. And we have a fair number of clients who would love to get in for language training. There are, at times, facility limitations. So, for example, in Campbell River, the classroom is kind of an open concept room, so it's not always easy for Chris to get privacy. And I recall assessing at one day where we had a flu shot clinic going on, and one of the kids did have a powerful reaction to getting a shot. So there was a lot of crying and screaming in the background while I was trying to assess somebody. The catchment size is a challenge. There are clients in sort of these communities that are much further away, and they really do want language training, or they want to be assessed, but it's just hard to get out to them. And if we did get out to them, our options to refer them are also pretty limited. So we would probably see if they were eligible for home study. And then after that, we'd probably try to connect them with a tutor. Our funder priorities are a challenge. So IRCC funded students, we can take them at quite a low level. They can come in with 0 or 1 in one of the skills, and we can take them, but provincially funded students are supposed to be a higher level and also have a pathway to employment. There's the potential conflict of interest that Vaso mentioned, and it is important that we be professional and ethical when we are assessing somebody. And then referring to LINC home study, we often, because we don't have intermediate or advanced level classes, we often refer to LINC home study, and that can be time consuming. There are time differences, so teacher availability and student availability may be difficult to match. And a lot of our clients seem to drop out inevitably, and I think that may be because they don't have a support person working with them more directly. Okay, and then despite all these challenges, I am really proud of what we've been able to accomplish in the last few years. And there are some benefits, I think, to this smaller center rural model area. And one of them is that we have one location for clients to access a variety of services. So when your transportation is quite difficult, we don't have a great bus system. So the fact that a client can come here and talk with a settlement worker, be assessed, take their language classes is a benefit for those students. Another one is that the instructor has an opportunity to meet with clients prior to the class. So I meet them during the assessment. Like Krista mentioned, the CLB-PT is a pretty friendly assessment. It's conducted in a pretty casual way, and I can sort of give the client some confidence or encouragement before they come into my class, and then they come into my class and they already know me. Another big benefit, I think, to the clients is the excellent communication between settlement and LINC. Settlement is able to share with me any challenges that the client is having with regards to language, and I can sort of address that as a student-based class. And then also, I know instructors know that a lot of times things come up in class where you can hear about students' lives and things that they're dealing with, and I can refer them back to settlement when things like that come up. The next point is that I never receive pressure from clients for certificates or retesting. I don't know if that's because there just are no other options, or they're comfortable or confident in where they're at and what they're studying. But they seem to accept that they get a placement test. That's the one that they have for 1 year, and then they move through my class, however, using PBLA as much as possible to move through the levels. And then finally, we have a great opportunity to build long-term relationships with the clients. They may come in to my class with level 1, and if they can continue studying with me until they level out at a level 4. So those are some of the benefits. Thanks very much for listening. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Marie, for your presentation. It was great to get to know a little bit more about how things work for you there in the Comox Valley and Campbell River as well. And likewise, I imagine things are quite similar, yet in different ways, but similar in the interior and north regions. So thank you for providing some information on that. Please send your questions in for Marie, Basso, and Krista by using the question box, tweeting them at AMSA events, or emailing them to sdemitra@amsa.org. We're now going to run our 5th poll to get to know your knowledge of the process of placement and LINC level designation. Please rate your awareness of the process of LINC level designation. Is your awareness robust? Is your awareness average? Or is your awareness more limited? And we've closed that poll to provide the results that 31% of people feel that their knowledge is robust, or 62% feel their awareness of level redesignation or designation and redesignation is average, that's 62% average, and 7% feel it's limited. So let's see if we can bring that average number of the average awareness up to a more robust awareness. And I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Wes Schroeder, to do that for us. He's been an ESL instructor, coordinator, and assessment specialist since 1979, having spent a number of years at the University of British Columbia English Language Institute and Vancouver Community College. He managed the first LINC Assessment Center in Canada while at VCC and established Western ESL Services, the LINC Assessment and Referral Center, in 1992. Since then, he has been responsible for eligibility determination, assessment and referral for approximately 200,000 LINC clients. He is certified by the CCLB as the National Master and Regional Trainer for the CLB-PT and for the Speaking Assessment of the Milestones Test. And Wes Schroeder, as Vaso-Valis, is also on various committees, including AMSA's Settlement Language Working Group. So I'll hand it over now to Wes to talk about the principles of placement.
Thank you, Julie, and good morning, everybody. I'll be focusing, of course, on the CLBPT and trying to draw a distinction between benchmarks that a client may receive and the LINC level that they will be placed into. As per the National LINC Placement Guidelines, learners are placed in a class where they will mainly focus on acquiring the competencies associated with the CLB level following the level they have already completed. For example, a client who has achieved benchmark 4 in reading would logically be placed in a LINC 5 reading course, where the curricular objective is to teach benchmark 5 competencies. However, there are few, if any, at least none that I am aware of, skill-specific classes in LINC programming in BC, unlike in some other provinces. So that means that learners need to be placed in an integrated class, which have a single LINC level designation. And because most learners do not receive the same benchmarks across all 4 skills, placement decisions are then based on a number of principles and algorithms. It is very simple to place learners with identical benchmarks across all 4 skills. The placement is simply based on the acquired benchmark plus 1. A client who has achieved benchmark 4 in all skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, can be said to be at benchmark 4 and is appropriately placed in a LINC 5 class. We must be careful not to refer to learners in a LINC 5 class as being at benchmark 5. In this case, where all benchmarks are identical, it could be appropriate to refer to them as being at benchmark 4. This is quite unusual, however, and generally occurs only at the very low levels, where clients are beginners in all 4 of the skills. Over time, however, different skills and competencies may develop at different rates, leading to more disparate benchmarks at the intermediate and higher levels. It is problematic when people refer to benchmarks in the singular, as in, what benchmark am I? The more appropriate question would be, what are my benchmarks? Because referring to a benchmark in the singular, it then easily gets confused with the LINC level. It also disregards the entire notion and purpose of the benchmarks as more accurate descriptors of a learner's competencies than a single number or traditional level descriptions such as beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Note that we always refer to the benchmark profiles in the order of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In BC, we have expanded somewhat on the national placement guidelines to indicate placement recommendations for clients with sort of what we call spiky profiles. The first principle, that's it, is to place the learner based on their listening and speaking benchmarks if they are lower than their reading and writing benchmarks. This is also reflected in the National Placement Guidelines as the priority. We first average the listening and speaking benchmarks and then the reading and writing benchmarks. If the average of listening and speaking is more than or equal to the reading and writing average, we round the listening speaking average down. If the listening and speaking average is less than the reading and writing average, we round the listening speaking average up, if rounding is necessary. So for example, if the listening speaking reading and writing is 5.4, 6.4, that means the listening speaking average is 4.5 or 4.5, and the reading and writing average is 5. So the listening and speaking average of 4.5 is rounded up to 5, and the learner is placed in a LINC level 6 class. That means they have achieved benchmark 5, so they'll be placed in a class with their achieved benchmark plus 1. In example 3, the listening speaking average is 5.5, where the client has 6.543, and the reading and writing average is 3.5. Because the listening and speaking average is higher than the reading and writing average in this case, the listening and speaking average is rounded down to 5, and because the difference between the rounded listening speaking average, which is 5, is 1.5 or less higher than the reading and writing average, the placement is simply the average of the listening, speaking, reading, and writing of all 4 skills plus 1. In this case, in example 3, it is 4.5 plus 1, which is 5.5 rounded down. That would be the placement for that LINC 5 for example 3. There are a number of other algorithms that may apply depending on how much higher the listening speaking average is than the reading and writing average. Those learners with listening and speaking benchmarks that are much higher than their reading and writing benchmarks will be placed based on another formula and flagged with the letter B. Example, LINC 5B. The B stands for bridge literacy, and it is then left to the instructor to determine if the placement is appropriate after a period of in-class observation once the learner has started class. It is beyond the scope of this webinar for me to go into too much detail regarding the placement algorithms. However, all assessors in BC have been given the detailed placement rules, which are also included in an appendix in the BC LINC guidelines document. They have also all been given a spreadsheet listing the placements for all possible benchmark combinations and an easy-to-use placement macro in Excel. If the basic placement principle is that clients are placed in a LINC class according to their completed benchmark +1, that leaves the question of then who was placed in a LINC 1 class when there is no such thing as benchmark 0. That, of course, would be those clients scoring pre-benchmark on reading and writing in the CLB-PT, since there is no such thing as benchmark 0. These learners are fully literate, or at least functionally literate, in their own language, but have very limited reading or writing skills in English, or are non-Roman alphabet ESL learners. The Assessment Center asks clients when they apply whether they can read and write in their own language. In fact, this is a mandatory field in iCare, and is why the question is included on the LINC application form. This information is sufficient to determine placement into a LINC literacy class, not requiring any further testing. We do not see many such clients in our assessment center. Out of about 7,000 assessments per year in our center, we are averaging only about 15 literacy learners per year, according to this definition of literacy. Partly because of the low number of literacy learners, we do not use the LPT in BC. The LPT is entirely in English, so gives no indication of a client's first language literacy skills. In other words, a low English level client who was perfectly literate in their own language may perform poorly on the literacy placement test or tool simply because they do not have the English. And we would also find it overkill to assess for 4 different levels of literacy, which is what the LPT does, when there are very few literacy clients and even fewer literacy classes, none of which are divided into different literacy levels. In fact, they are often a multi-level class together with LINC 1. We make no such detailed diagnosis or sub-leveling at any other benchmark and feel it is best left to the professional literacy instructor to conduct a literacy needs analysis. Indeed, the LPT is available to instructors, not only assessors for this purpose, as Krista already pointed out. The CLBPT is a quick and dirty little streamlined placement test that is less rigorous than other longer standardized tests, and as Krista already mentioned, is deemed to be accurate within one benchmark 9 times out of 10. Consequently, the placements that result from the test are simply a recommendation from the assessor as to the level at which a learner should best start their program. The language training organizations do have the option of redesignating the client's level after intake. It is the responsibility of the training provider to redesignate a learner's level after intake where warranted, after a period of informed in-class observation or other needs analysis process that they have in place. For our own information and service evaluation, we appreciate it if training providers inform us of any level redesignations due to inappropriate placement. They do not need to ask permission to move a learner to a different level. We just ask that they inform us, the assessment center. I maintain statistics on level redesignations and can report that in recent years, the number of learners whose level was redesignated by the language training organization shortly after intake has been averaging about 0.5% of all assessments conducted, which is a very high accuracy rate, if you ask me. And if you're interested, of these level redesignations, about 2/3 have moved the learner to a higher level, and about 1/3 have moved the learner to the lower level. In borderline assessments in our center, assessors tend to consider it in the learner's best interest to start at the lower level. There are often cases where clients need to have their benchmarks assessed in order to access other programs, non-LINC programs, some of which may not even have a language training component. This, as Krista mentioned, is out of the scope and mandate of the CLBPT and the federally funded language assessment process in BC. However, as long as a client is eligible for LINC and completes a LINC application, they have the right to be assessed. We cannot control what they then do with the assessment results. However, keep in mind that a client can be assessed maximum once per year. They cannot simply ask to be repeatedly reassessed until they have achieved the desired benchmarks. As a LINC assessment center, it is impractical to combine federally funded assessment services with fee-for-service assessments, where some clients get their assessment for free and others have to pay. And if we did, a cost allocation formula would need to be established so that the center is not making profit from expenses covered by IRCC. There are a number of non-LINC CLBPT licensed assessment sites in BC who use the CLBPT for placement to some of their non-LINC programs, such as VCC, ISS, Mosaic, Camosun College, and University of the Fraser Valley. And some of these may also offer fee-for-service CLBPT assessments. And that ends my little contribution here. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Wes. That is very interesting information. And I think I need to review that in the BC LINC guidelines, just because it's a lot to take in, but very interesting. Thank you. Please send your questions for Wes using the GoToWebinar question box, Twitter, or estimitra@amsa.org. You've heard it many times before, but now is the time for our question and answer session. So I have a question here that has come in. We heard a lot of acronyms today. Do you have an acronym list that you can share? Now, this is a great question. AMSA does have, for its own purposes, acronyms lists to onboard new staff and so on and stay on top of these. But I'd like to put that question to Krista. Does the CCLB website have a good page where all of the tests and acronyms may be listed?
Not in one particular page, no, it does not. But we could certainly email that to you, Julie, and you could email it to anyone who might be interested. I could put a list of that together.
That would be fantastic, Krista. I do think that there is a need to keep those acronyms in one place and the names of the tests and you know, a few keywords about what they are, whether low stakes, high stakes, etc. So thank you for that. Please keep sending those questions in. This is something that comes up quite a lot, so I thought I would put this out. The question is, how long is the CLBPT valid for? There seems to be some discrepancy around this. I've heard that some assessment centers receive clients within the window of 12 months. So maybe, Krista, would you be able to speak to that? How long is the CLBPT valid for?
Yeah, for sure. As mentioned, in terms of IRCC funded programming, it's considered valid for 12 months. So that's across all IRCC funded programming. Any program that might be outside of that funded programming, it's possible they may set different parameters, which could be why you might be hearing of a discrepancy. So again, we just want to focus on the fact that it is a test for low stakes purposes, placement into language training program. So the question would be, why would somebody be looking for a revised CLBPT placement test? Of course, there could be individual circumstances that might have a specific reason as to why they are wishing to be retested. And so at that point, the assessment center can review the request and make a decision based on that circumstance. But in terms of validity, IRCC funded programming, it's valid for 12 months.
Excellent. Thank you, Krista. So I have another question here, and I will direct this question to you, Vaso. And then if anyone else would like to add, we would love to hear from you as well. The question is, what advice can you give for assessors who witnessed clients' test-taking anxiety? This also happens at the delivery level of the assessment for and of learning, with clients worries about, oh, there's an assessment coming, and certainly I'm sure it happens at the assessment centers as well, and in other forms of assessment, remote and itinerant. So could you speak to that, please,
We pay a lot of attention to this subject of anxiety. We assure the client that this is a low-stakes test. It is not a test itself. It is an assessment, and they have to be relaxed. And we're going to try to place them where they should be going. We'll do the best for them. Basically, we need to make them feel comfortable in our own environment. And that's why also we start by asking them, how are you today, and from where did you come, and this question before we enter the assessment phase.
Thank you, Vaso. And let's perhaps hear from Marie as well. Do you have any comments on that, Marie? Assessment anxiety, clients test taking anxiety?
Yeah, I've definitely had a couple of clients with anxiety, and same thing, you just try to reassure them that it's really just to get a sense of what types of things they would need to be studying in class, where to start them out at. But I can think of two clients in particular that definitely, whose scores were much less than when I actually got them in the class and saw that what they could actually do. Yeah.
We also keep reminding the clients that this is not a pass or fail assessment. This is just a picture of where they are right now, just a quick picture of what is happening today. No need to sweat about passing or failing.
Great, thank you. Another question is somewhat related. What language supports can service providing organizations in smaller centers recommend for clients waiting for CLBPTs in those, rural regions where there isn't always somebody? So perhaps, I don't know if Krista, you'd like to, if you have any comments about that, let's pass it over to you.
It might be, Marie, I think you could probably definitely weigh in here. What I would say, and something that Marie has actually already brought up, and Vaso, in terms of the CLBPT, there is no prep that you can do. It is to try and get a sense of where a client is. So, I mean, a client could, for sure, they could go on to that online self-assessment if they wanted to, just to kind of get a sense of types of questions that are asked for their reading and listening. They can do that in English and French. Again, it's not going to provide them any further ahead as to where they would go with their language assessment. But yeah, we get this question a lot of what can I do in the meantime and how do I prepare? And you don't prepare. It's a sense of where you are at that moment, which is also why any particular college or organization that's out there that's providing prep courses for the CLBPT would be completely invalid in terms of what the test should be or what the test is designed for. In terms of the CLBPT, it might be possible that depending on where they're located, if they're at a particular site and the sites are aware that there are remote assessment options available, they could always look at connecting with the 3 remote sites that I've provided. But of course, again, that might be something that either Wes or one of those particular organizations could kind of weigh in on how they set up that proctor training and proctor site. So that could be an option if they didn't want to wait for an itinerant assessment, because as was mentioned, it is costly to be able to send somebody out to a particular location, and it can take some time for someone to get their assessment. I'm not sure if that helps, but Marie, maybe you might want to jump in there.
Yeah, for sure. We would never want somebody to come to our center and get sort of turned away with nothing. So if the person is computer literate, I do have a list of websites where they can practice their English while they're waiting. I also send them to the library. We have a good relationship with our local library. They have ESL materials, and they also have language training platforms on their computers that the students can access. And I also refer them to another organization here. It's called the Lifelong Learning Center, and they sometimes can partner person with a tutor, and they have some conversation classes going on. So those are the kind of the 4 things that we can do.
Great, thank you very much, Marie. I have one more question for our question and answer period today, and then we're going to do our final poll. So the last question is about adaptations or accommodations in language assessment. This may be for clients with very low literacy levels. This may be with clients with disabilities. They may not be able to write the test. This may even be for clients who cannot have their child not be in the room with them. And so what kind of adaptations or accommodations do you make? Let's hear from you on that, Wes.
Well, with regard to children being in the testing room, we do advise clients that this is normally not permitted. It depends a bit on the nature, the child, the age of the child, and how well behaved they are. But it also happens that we will. The listening and speaking interview is one-on-one. And the assessors are very experienced and very accommodating and patient, and they can often handle it if there's a baby in their office as well, if they're not too fussy and so on. But it works out. And often what we'll do then, instead of bringing them into the larger testing room, where it's sort of like group testing, where they do the reading and writing in a larger room with multiple clients doing it at the same time, we will have that client with their child do that reading and writing test in the assessor's office, and the assessor just works around that until that client has left. There are other accommodations possible for people with some visual impairment, although if you're blind, that we can only, of course, do the listening and speaking test, and we just put NA for not assessed or not applicable for the other 2 scores. We do have the option of, for example, enlarging the visuals. For example, with a reading test, we can enlarge that like to 1 question per page if we need to. The more difficult, and we also have a pair of drugstore glasses always on hand to help people who maybe have forgotten their glasses, or maybe don't even realize they need glasses. The more difficult challenge is those that have hearing impairments. There's only so much you can do with increasing the volume of the listening test, for example, or your own volume as an assessor. But I think the bigger challenge is not so much the assessment, but then after the assessment, where are these people best accommodated? And what kind of programming is there available, especially for them? And it's basically non-existent. And the simple fact that it's a required element that we have to put into eye care, whether a person is deaf or hard of hearing or blind or partially sighted, it's a mandatory field in eye care, so we have to ask all clients. Simply asking them that question sort of gives them the impression, well, then there must be something available if I say yes to this. But unfortunately, there is a LINC/American Sign Language program offered at VCC that I'm aware of. But other than that, there used to also be something for the blind at VCC, but I don't think that exists anymore.
Okay, thanks, Wes. So that's a great way to pass it once more back to Krista at the CCLB. We're so grateful that you were able to participate in this webinar. What can service providers and LINC training organizations in British Columbia look forward to in the future when it comes to maybe more PBLA or language training supports to support clients, diverse clients, clients with disabilities, and so on?
It's definitely something that's been on the radar, and actually in terms of the CLBPA development, it's one of those, the Center for Education and Training actually has a pretty a pretty good accommodations document right now for their current test, but we've really made sure that in terms of the development of this new test, that this is taken into consideration, and that assessment centers are provided with ways in which they can accommodate for particular learners based on the test itself. So that is something that we are working on with the development of the new test, which our current test, the CLBPT, is not it's lacking in that area. I agree with everything that Wes said in terms of the accommodations that are they are the recommendations that CCLB would say, and we also know that in terms of where is the client going afterwards, and if there is a program that's able to support whatever it is that they need. Again, that's something beyond CCLB because we're just the developers of the test and the certifiers of the organization. So we're not necessarily familiar in terms of all the programming that's out there and the accommodations that might need to be made for particular individuals. For PBLA, it's still rolling out. They have the practice guidelines, which I had indicated that's recently been revised, or if it hasn't been revised yet, the new document will be up soon. So anyone that is conducting classes with PBLA, they will be able to refer to that and get more information on what's coming. We are developing new modules. There's new module planning. We're planning the development for PBLA for specific purposes. Currently, it's funded by Ontario, but we're hoping that that will again be widespread across the country. So anything with CCLB nationally, of course, BC would be aware as any other province as to what would be coming. But right now, I would say the biggest or the next phase is that CLB-A test, which will be coming probably 2019, 2020.
Thank you so much, Krista, for that information. And now I'd like to make a few closing remarks. Thank you for joining us today, everyone, and for sending in your poll results and questions for Unpacking LINC Placement, Delivery, and Assessment. We will be emailing you with an online evaluation form just to get a little bit more information from you about how things went. So please take the time to fill that out. Only 3 or 4 minutes of your time is required. And a special thank you goes out to our speakers, Krista, Vaso, Marie, and Wes, for giving us their time and sharing of their experience to support the settlement language sector. So thank you, presenters. And thank you finally to the AMSA team, to Con on tech, Sabrina and Melissa J on social media and tech support. We'll be posting the presentations and resources on the AMSA website and sending out notification on SetNet when they're posted. So if you don't receive the weekly updates for SetNet, log into our website and sign up at the link on the slide. It's free. And last but not least, we couldn't be doing this without funding from Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.